Okay, hey Yago, welcome to the Coinscrum Meet the Founders interview series. My name is Yatu. I am an anthropologist working in the crypto space. And it's nice to have you here. I thought we'd start off with maybe you can say a little bit about your background and how you got into the world of cryptocurrencies.
Sure. So my background, sort of academically, is in neuroscience, and I was working. I started a startup in the U.S. Uh, trying to take what we were learning about neural networks and apply it to diagnostic screening for for biomarkers for various bowel diseases. So that was what I was doing at the time. And because I was reading a lot into network science back in 2011, I came across the Satoshi whitepaper. And it completely screwed everything up. All of my plans got thrown out the window. That morning, I emailed everyone I knew. I told them they have to get into Bitcoin. This was going to be the biggest thing of our generation. And a few months later, resigned my position at the company I had founded, and I moved to San Francisco, and I have been involved in Bitcoin ever since.
And what was it in the paper that made you think this was it? This is the thing that really I'm into?
Well, it was a few things. I think on a personal level, you know, I grew up in South Africa to a family who were fighting the apartheid government, were affiliated with the ANC, and were forced to flee the country because they were forced out. And so at a very young age, I became a gold smuggler trying to get money out of the country to my family. And I grew up on stories of not just these activities, but the fact that my family were forced to, liquidate all of their wealth in Europe and swallow gems in order to be able to survive World War II. And and I myself, had been involved in politically active all my life. So for me, the idea that there should be a way for people to be financially sovereign, to have the right to control their own economic destiny, was always, to me, most obviously the most important of all human rights. Right? We celebrate free speech, but there is no form of speech more important than money. That's why when we want to say, to someone they should say exactly what they mean, we tell them to put their money where their mouth is, because it is the way that you truly express your deepest desires, your deepest beliefs. It's the way you protect your family. It's the way you think about your future. And so denying people economic rights, either through capital controls or inflation or confiscation, those are the worst transgressions of people's rights that are performed by society and almost always performed by governments. And so I saw Bitcoin immediately as a way in which we could provide protection and discipline. We could discipline governments by providing an alternative and providing a way for people to really be financially sovereign. And I also saw a way in which young people, 8 or 9 years old, would never have to smuggle gold out of any country ever again in order to get money to their family, which, struck a very personal note for me. And then beyond that, beyond being politically active, I think I've also always really been interested in the progress of mankind and how we can create a better future and what the future may look like. And it was always obvious to me that we were going to use the internet to remake the world, and that it was less wasteful. It allowed people to, it was fairer. Anyone in the world can communicate with anyone. I'm now working on a project where people from around the world are contributing. It's not just people from London or not just people from San Francisco. And so the internet allowed that. But what the internet lacked was a way to truly have an economic system. There was no digitally native economic system for the internet until Bitcoin came around. And this invention of a digital commodity, right? The whole idea of a digital commodity was mind-blowing. I think still is mind-blowing, because if you think about digital, you think about something which is going to be copied for free an infinite number of times. And that's always been the biggest weakness of digital rights. It's always been the biggest weakness of digital scarcity, digital value. And what Satoshi Nakamoto demonstrated in that paper, and then later by releasing Bitcoin, was that it was possible. And in that, Bitcoin changed the world. So for all of those reasons, it was, to me, you know, I've heard a lot of people say that they've heard about Bitcoin and it took them a while to warm up to it. I was ready to go. You had me at hello.
That's interesting. So you have quite a personal kind of connection to cryptocurrencies and, well, Bitcoin in particular, which we'll come into in your kind of belief in Bitcoin. You know, you've also, you know, once you got into crypto, you've been in the space for a really long time now, and you've tried a few things along the way. Can you tell us about your journey since you got into crypto, and your latest project now, and what you've learned along the way in these kind of different projects that you've tried?
Yeah, so I've been involved in Bitcoin in a number of ways. One of the first things that I did was I went to work at a company called Zynga, which at the time was the fastest growing games company in the world. And I went to work there because I wanted to learn what they knew about popularizing digital assets. And that was the closest I could get at the time. But I helped make Zynga one of the first companies in the world to start accepting Bitcoin as a payment method. Mm-hmm. And then with my brother, I set up a company called BXIL. And what BXIL was doing was processing payments for exchanges that were having their bank accounts shut down, which was something which was happening throughout 2013, 2014. And then from there, we set up a company called Epiphyte. And what we were doing with Epiphyte is we were working with the banks. We wanted to try and co-opt the banks to get them on side so that bank accounts wouldn't have to get shut down ever again. And we did a lot of really cool things. We helped create the sandbox, the regulatory sandbox in the UK, which is now being copied around the world. We got banks like BBVA, Santander, CBA, Sberbank, and a number of others to start working with us and prototype Bitcoin as a global settlement mechanism. And we started doing remittance to countries like China, Nigeria, Brazil, Zimbabwe, where it was very hard to get money to without other means. And, you know, so I've been involved in a number of different projects, sometimes for profit, sometimes, you know, more like non-profit activities over the course of the years. And I think the thing that's always driven me is trying to get Bitcoin into the hands of people before they know they need it. Because often, once you know you need it, it's too late. Mm-hmm. So for me, you know, you mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in Bitcoin in particular, more than, say, cryptocurrency. I don't really think of myself as being into crypto as much as being into Bitcoin. Although I find the entire space extremely interesting, and I think a huge amount of innovation is happening outside of Bitcoin. But the reason I have a particular affinity for Bitcoin is because I think the real opportunity here, the big opportunity, is to create a new global monetary standard. And I think that there is nothing, Bitcoin is our best, maybe only chance at doing that. And that's important because if we do that, we will put Bitcoin into the hands of everyone before they need it. And if we do that, then they probably will never need it.
Interesting. So talking about your project now, your Sovryn project. So how does that kind of speak to where you think the crypto space is at the moment? You think, like, how are you reading the landscape? What do you think it is, and how does your project kind of fit into that?
So we are in an interesting time for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is starting to become more popular. There's tens of millions of people that are using it. And most people, when they think about the security of Bitcoin, they think about, you know, hash power. Maybe they think about public-private keys. They think about not your keys, not your coins. And then they turn around and go use a centralized exchange where they go and dox themselves with KYC and give up all their private information, and they give their coins over to a centralized service. And it's true that hash power and public-private key cryptography are two of the important pieces of what makes Bitcoin secure. But they're not the only things. And they're not the only avenues of attack for people who would look to attack Bitcoin. And in fact, the most likely way that Bitcoin would be attacked is not by some kind of 51% attack, or not because someone managed to crack the cryptography. It's most likely going to be by regulations and rules that are currently being put in place. So, you know, a week ago they shut down BitMEX, or Neron shut down BitMEX. They're going after Tether. They're going after OKCoin. OKX. And this is not new. This has been going on since forever. When we were running Epiphyte, we constantly were having our bank accounts shut down. So it's not new, but it's going to become more important, and it's going to become more aggressive as Bitcoin becomes more important. And it's going to become more important as crypto becomes more important. So I think the risk that people maybe don't think about enough, and because it's the most likely risk and it's already happening, is the risk of something like what the United States, which was the most free, the most advanced, the most democratic country in the world, did in 1935, which was confiscate everyone's gold. And they could confiscate everyone's gold because everyone held their gold with banks and depository institutions. And so it was very easy to know who had gold. And they just one day, with an executive order by President Roosevelt, confiscated it all. And so if your Bitcoin is in Coinbase or in Binance or in Kraken or in Bitstamp, the chance that that will happen, or the chance that they will track your activity through the KYC, or the chance that they will limit which addresses you can transact to by limiting which addresses those exchanges can transact to, and limit when and where you can withdraw your funds. This is already happening. It's happening in Switzerland, right? The capital of financial freedom have now instituted a rule where exchanges will not allow you to withdraw your own Bitcoin to your own wallet. You have to withdraw to another centralized regulated entity. So this is already happening. And that brings me to what I'm working on now, which is a project called Sovryn. And what Sovryn is it's a decentralized, censorship-resistant, permissionless alternative to these financial services. Now, if you think about what Bitcoin is a permissionless, uncensorable layer or technology for the monetary system, right? So the Bitcoin, what it creates is Bitcoin, which is a monetary tool for freedom. And I think the next stage in our evolution is to go beyond the monetary to decentralizing the financial layer. And then if we do that, we'll go to the final stage, which is decentralizing the economic layer, which is transactions, payments, the way people accept salary, etc. So now we need to move to stage 2. And that means really taking seriously this idea of censorship resistance and permissionlessness. And that's important because it's what protects people's sovereignty, and it's also what allows for a truly global system, which is not limited by the geographic rules of specific countries. And so what we're what we're building with Sovryn is a decentralized alternative to BlockFi or Binance or BitMEX. So you can trade, you can do leverage trading, you can borrow, you can lend without ever having to give up control or custody, and doing so through a decentralized, permissionless system, which as a result also doesn't have the necessity for you to dox you and can never stop you from withdrawing your tokens to any place.
Nice. And so I was just thinking when you were saying that, so who are the people? So sorry, I'm not very technically minded about these things. But so people, in the finance space, who are they? So at the moment, it's mainly kind of big players, right? Kind of traders rather than kind of the daily people. So how are they going to kind of come into kind of the lending kind of space in decent DeFi, do you think?
So I think what you're referring to a great extent is an artifact of the fact that DeFi is happening on Ethereum, right?
Mhm.
And the issue with Ethereum is that transaction fees are between $5 and $40 when you're using one of these DeFi platforms. Which, if you have to pay $40 to make a trade, right? Your trade has to be huge in order for you to have any chance of profitability. So we're not building on Ethereum. We're building on a Bitcoin sidechain. So we're building on Bitcoin. The native currency is Bitcoin, and you'll be able to pay fees in Bitcoin. And the fees are 2 orders of magnitude lower than what they are on Ethereum. So a basic transaction can cost you anywhere between a few fractions of a cent to maybe, if it's a very complex transaction, tens of cents, right?
Mm.
And this is important because, like I said earlier, our goal is to try and provide tools that anyone can use. Now, that said, we're not trying to build a system right now that people who have not really been introduced into the crypto space yet are going to be using. This is something for people who are already in the space and already have some funds. And that's important because there's a ladder in terms of where Bitcoin needs to go. So Bitcoin has always started out, it started out with exchanges, these centralized exchanges that drive liquidity. If you have that liquidity, then you can start doing remittance, you can start doing payments, you can start doing lending and borrowing. You can start doing all of these things which provide for real economic value. But before you can provide for that economic value, you need to provide for the liquidity that comes through financial value. And so we're concentrated on building out that financial layer, which is a very important set of tools. In fact, it's the most popular and most obvious use case right now for Bitcoin and for all cryptocurrency. And there's also another way in which there's a ladder. So there's a ladder of personal sovereignty, or a ladder of personal freedom, right? People start out, you're a no coiner, you don't know anything about Bitcoin, or you reject the idea, you want to hold on to your fiat, and you're not very free. And then you do a little bit of research, right? The first stage to freedom is information, because information is power. And so you educate yourself a little bit. Now, you don't have any Bitcoin yet, but you're a little bit more free than you were before. And then maybe you buy some Bitcoin on Coinbase. So now you've elevated yourself one layer higher. And then you realize that you shouldn't keep your money on Coinbase. So you withdraw it and you set yourself up with your own wallet. Maybe it's already a multi-sig wallet. Maybe you understand the difference between hot wallet and cold wallet. Now you're really in control, right? You're sovereign. You're in direct control of your funds. And if you've done all of those things, then I think you're ready for sovereign, which is taking it the next step. Because now your financial activity can be as free as the funds that you're holding. So it's more than just be your own bank. It's make sure that the transactions that you're doing while you're being your own bank maintain that degree of freedom.
Mm. Interesting, interesting. Yeah, I think that was the kind of question I was kind of clumsily getting at. How are the people kind of gonna come back into normal people coming into the space? But you're kind of arguing that it's the liquidity that kind of the financial structure of DeFi kind of provides to kind of bring those people kind of into space.
Yeah, I think innovation is an iterative process, and you kind of need to build one step after another. You need to build one layer after another. But we are looking to help facilitate a lot of different things with Sovryn. In the future, we hope to allow for people to do more efficient P2P trading. So right now, if you are in London or Calcutta or Johannesburg and you want to trade with people, um, in your own area, P2P, avoid having to go through a centralized exchange, right? So there's a number of platforms you can do this. Some of them, like Hodl Hodl, are relatively censorship resistant, don't have KYC, but you need to have a lot of Bitcoin to be able to do that. by building out a platform which has the ability to provide lending, we can now lend to people like that so that they can effectively trade more Bitcoin than they actually have, right? You start to do that. Now you start to allow remittance use cases, which is something I'm deeply familiar with. You start to allow for global trade use cases. You start to allow for regular people to start thinking about how they were going to manage their savings in Argentina or Venezuela or countries which are suffering from substantial inflation. You start to allow for stable coins, which are backed by Bitcoin. So in our system, we have a stable coin called DOC, which is a Bitcoin-backed stable coin, which is how you start to create, truly free money, which can also be used by regular people with a relatively low level of understanding. And so there's an ecosystem that we're building, and we're trying to build the additional fundamental building blocks that are going to be important for it.
Yeah, yeah, that's nicely put. Thank you. And so, so you're in a good position to also have, because you've been in the space a while, to perhaps say a bit about like, any cultural shift that's happened on, from the side of the people who are like kind of building this space and building this ecosystem. Have you noticed any milestones along the way? Maybe any significant milestones along the way, and any significant like cultural shift that you noticed?
Yes, there's one cultural shift that bothers me quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When I first got into Bitcoin, there was a overwhelming sense of ambition and optimism and innovation and adventure that Bitcoiners had in common. And I think that some of that has been not so much lost, but maybe momentarily forgotten, is what I would say. And I think the reason that happened was there was the double whammy of the block size wars, where Bitcoiners as a community were at war with each other around whether or not to increase the size of Bitcoin blocks. And at the same time, the emergence of Ethereum and the ICO space, which introduced a very uncomfortable level of fraud and sort of unsavory competition to Bitcoin's monetary status. And as a result, the Bitcoin community became more conservative, more defensive, and I think very unfortunately, very dismissive of everything that happens outside of Bitcoin, and less willing to sort of have the same sense of adventure that it had once. There used to be a phrase in Bitcoin that was one of the most common memes in the Bitcoin space, right? It was any technology which improves or can add to Bitcoin will simply be adopted by Bitcoin. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're building on RSK, which is a Bitcoin sidechain, which has all of the capabilities of Ethereum. And I think one of the reasons that we're doing this is we're also want to make a statement. We want to bring back the sense of adventure and excitement to Bitcoin. And we also want to say, yes, there are potentially valuable technologies out there that were not built by Bitcoiners. And we should be paying a lot of attention to them. We should be paying attention to them because they are a potential threat, because they are potentially useful, and because if we think of Bitcoiners as ourselves, as adversarial thinkers, then the number one thing an adversarial thinker needs to have is curiosity about the enemy. And so we want to show that, Bitcoin, the monetary base, is more than just a monetary base. It is also the foundation for a free and open economic system. And that the technologies that will make that happen are not necessarily only things that were originated with Bitcoin. And so we've adopted some of the technologies that were built on Ethereum, and we think that projects like Uniswap or MakerDAO or Compound have really done remarkable things for decentralization that all Bitcoiners should be paying attention to.
Nice. And so Paul wanted me to ask this question, which is, I think you kind of touched upon this a lot. Is Bitcoin ready to support DeFi as many think it's not up to scratch?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. What's Paul trying to get at there? Why do people think it's not up to the scratch?
we're building Sovryn, and I think Sovryn cleaves extremely closely to the basic principles and aspirations of Bitcoin, which is to say, it helps Bitcoiners and everyone maintain their control over their funds, maintain their financial and economic sovereignty. But because we say this is DeFi, because we say we've used some technologies from Ethereum, because we say we have a token, which by the way is not competing with Bitcoin, it's not like an altcoin, it's an equity token. Bitcoiners kind of, not all of them, most of them are very open-minded, but there's a certain type of Bitcoin maximalist, which is just the whiff of technology that wasn't built by us. Is a threat, is perceived as a threat. So, that type of Bitcoiner, I think we might have more of a struggle getting on board with the program. But actually, I think maybe they were just waiting for something to reignite the excitement for them. Because I've been talking to my friends, I've been talking to my maximalist friends, and the more we talk, the more they like what we're doing with Sovryn.
Interesting. So I'm always curious, I guess, from just maybe an anthropology kind of background, who is actually in the Bitcoin community now? I guess like ICO, maybe when it was smaller, it kind of made sense who was kind of in the Bitcoin community. But now I kind of work with loads of scams and come across a wide range of people that, use Bitcoin.
Right.
So what do you understand by the term Bitcoin community? Who do you kind of think about when you think of the term, like, Bitcoin?
I think it's very broad, and I'll take you back to that letter that I was describing, right? I mean, people who don't even have Bitcoin but are interested in it, are doing the research. They're in the community. They're not deep in the community. They haven't adopted the community maybe as much as other people, but they're part of our community. People who hold funds on Coinbase are part of our community. People who hold wallets are a deeper part of our community, perhaps, but they're part of our community. And people who reject Ethereum or anything that was built on Ethereum, just because it's Ethereum, are part of our community. It's a very broad community, and it's becoming ever broader. So that is, to me, gratifying. It's where I think we want to be. There is a risk there, right? That we lose sort of the purity of the mission, lose the purity of the narrative. But I think that there's a way to deal with it, which is to have very, very clear idea of what it is that are the fundamental lines that we will not accept being crossed. One of those is you don't change Bitcoin main chain, right? You don't introduce changes to Bitcoin without overwhelming and obvious consensus, right? So what they try to do with increasing the block size, that easily fails that test. I think also at the same time, when they didn't allow the debate on many Bitcoin forums, such as Bitcoin Reddit, I think that was a mistake as well, because that didn't cross the line. Talking about making a change doesn't cross the line. Making the change without consensus does. I think if we can remember to maintain Bitcoin in that way, and if we also recognize that crypto isn't the enemy, but altcoins which try to be Bitcoin, right? Which try to be money, which try to invent scarcity out of nothing, like Bitcoin and Satoshi did, they're the enemy. If we just have those two very clear rules around what our culture and our community is, then we can be hyper-inclusive about everything else. And indeed, we should be hyper-inclusive, because if we want to achieve hyper-Bitcoinization, if we want to have Bitcoin become the reserve currency of the world, it can't be an exclusive thing. It can't be a situation where you need to be technical to be free. It needs to be hyper-inclusive.
Interesting. And one more thought on what is, I never really asked this question, but what is a Bitcoin maximalist to you?
Well, I suppose in some ways I'm a Bitcoin maximalist, right? Although I tend not to call myself one. I started calling myself a Bitcoin mutant because I want to see Bitcoin as a technology continue to mutate, not by changing Bitcoin main chain, but by introducing things like Lightning Network and side chains. So I think a Bitcoin maximalist is someone who understands a very fundamental idea, which I call Satoshi's paradox, which is that if anyone can create a cryptocurrency, then nobody can. What Satoshi invented, and this sort of brings us full circle, right? What Satoshi invented, what blew my mind, was that he created digital scarcity. And if you can go and create multiple different coins, and every Vitalik and Justin Sun in the world can create their own coin, then that inflates that scarcity. And so anyone who's concerned about building something which is going to provide fundamental value, and the value must be fundamental because everyone in the world needs to be able to rely upon it. Because everyone in the world needs to be able to rely on it to protect their sovereignty. Then we need to reject these attempts to create a new Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't need to be improved. It's perfect the way it is. It provides the one thing that we actually need, which is uncensorable, permissionless digital scarcity. Everything else is a footnote. And so I think a Bitcoin maximalist ultimately is someone who understands that.
Nice. Just to go back to something that you said about so bringing about this kind of Bitcoin-led future, do you think there's a compromise to be made? These are kind of classic questions that you get between centralization and decentralization for you, or is something more like it's decentralization or nothing for you?
I think the comparison I like to make, so I use the word sovereignty. We've even called the project sovereign, right? What is sovereignty? Sovereignty is when you make the rules. And in our case, we're talking about individual sovereignty. And so what I mean by that is I think you should make the rules for yourself. And that's what I think freedom is. Now, if you look at sovereigns, and who are the sovereigns today, right? The sovereigns are nation states. Sovereigns are extremely jealous, extremely protective of their sovereignty. There is no higher crime than treason, right? They even call it high treason just to emphasize just how high a crime it is. And they will go to every, they will take every measure to make sure that if you are breaking not the law, but attacking the law itself, right? So you're not paying your taxes, you're providing people with information which they want to hold secret, you are involved or engaged in what they would refer to as treason, you are printing money, right? I mean, they print money all the time, but if you print any money, it's an extremely serious crime. It's counterfeiting, right? Why do they do this? Why do they take all these things so seriously? Because they see even the smallest infraction of their sovereignty as a potential threat which could lead to further infractions and ultimately the erosion of their sovereignty. And yet we, as individuals, we will give up our privacy, we will give up our rights for the convenience of having someone like a post of ours on Twitter or on Facebook, or, we are extremely unconscientious when it comes to our sovereignty. So I don't think it's decentralization or nothing. I think there's often the case that we are, lulled into, or we are tempted to give up our sovereignty for some kind of convenience. It's almost always going to be the case that centralized services can offer conveniences that decentralized services can't. I think it's up to us to do two things. For the developers and the people building systems like Sovryn, we are working very hard to make it as easy to use, and in some cases easier to use, more convenient than a centralized service. So for example, it's less friction to use Sovryn. You don't have to go through KYC. You can withdraw your funds whenever you want. You actually never give up control of your funds at all. In many ways, there's less friction. So providing a really easy user experience, super important. And that's something that developers need to do. What individuals need to do is they need to become as jealous and guarded of their sovereignty as sovereigns, right? Because otherwise you don't get to be a sovereign. And so if you want to be a sovereign individual, you need to realize that anyone who gives up their freedom for a little bit of convenience deserves neither.
Interesting. Yeah. So for you, the project is also about changing kind of the consciousness of the community and the people that are using, and their relationship to money as well, right? As rather than just thinking about it as having like, okay, you have Bitcoin now, their kind of attitude towards money needs to change as well, which is quite a complex process, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, my Twitter bio says that most people work to make money and we work to remake money. Um, I, I see money as extremely important, but not because I want to buy a Lambo. I see money as extremely important because it is the truest expression. It is my great grandmother used to say that there were only two things that were truly important in life: health and money. And she was beloved by her community. She was an extremely gregarious person who volunteered her time. She didn't work, as a miser. She was extremely generous with money. So what I took that to mean is those were the two important things, because those were the basic fundamental things that you needed in order to have the basic set of requirements in order to pursue your own happiness and to pursue the happiness of the people who care for who you care for. So I would say freedom of money is more important than freedom of speech. Freedom of money is more important than your right to vote. Freedom of money is more important than your right to drive a Lambo. And that is why it's a lifelong goal for me to try and provide tools and create the environment where people will be less vulnerable to others.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, I work a lot with kind of like, kind of trying to understand what money is, which I always get kind of lost in that kind of literature, but that's kind of nice the way you put it. It's kind of a way to explore, your happiness in its simplest form, I guess, right? It's a necessity to live a good life, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And you asked, what is money? Money is encapsulated value, right? It's a social contract around how we will measure value. And the money that you have is your way of storing value, right? So if you value the future more than you value the present, you hold on to money. That's savings. If you value a family member's health, you help them out. That's value. It's the way you express your fundamental values.
interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's most of the questions we had. Just thinking if there was anything else. No. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks, Eden, for joining us. And good luck with the project. And we'll keep a close eye on it.
Thank you very much. And I'd invite everyone to try out Sovryn. It's sovryn.app, so sovryn.app. Come claim your sovereignty. Thank you very much.
On